So, time then for the press preview. It's our first look at tomorrow's front pages, and tonight we're going to have a look at the headlines with HuffPost UK's political editor, Kevin Schofield, who's joined by the Spectator's economics editor, Kate Andrews. Great to see you both. We will chat in a moment after we've told you about those front pages, starting with the Express, carrying a warning that nurses' strikes could last until Christmas. But the Eye says the government is hopeful that fractures among unions could spoil any proposed industrial action. While the Metro hears that the NHS is spending £1 million a week drafting in private ambulances to cover the gaps when their own fleet of emergency vehicles is overstretched. The Guardian is focusing tomorrow on another part of the health service that's under strain, reporting that 250,000 children have missed out on access to mental health treatment. While the Mail has seen figures suggesting that 6,500 sexual assaults are committed in the country's hospitals each week. The Times leads with a speech by the Prime Minister tomorrow where he'll call for changes to make sure all adults learn to do at least basic maths. According to the FT, the Bank of England may revamp its deposit guarantee scheme, which protects people's savings. And the chap on the front of the Star is perhaps a little overexcited that it's going to be 20 degrees in some parts of the country tomorrow. And don't forget, you can scan the QR code that you see on screen during the programme. Have a look for yourself at the front pages while you watch us discussing them. And to do that, Kate Andrews and Kevin Schofield are here. Great to see you this Sunday evening. Let's start with the nurses' strike, shall we? Kate, front of the Daily Express. Nurses warn strikes could last all year. MPs and the Prime Minister, of course, back to work after the Easter break tomorrow. This is the sort of headline that Rishi Sunak will not want to be seeing.
Well, after last week's record-long NHS walkout that involved the junior doctors, everyone from the healthcare workers to the government to, of course, patients are asking what's next. And the Royal College of Nursing rejected the pay deal that had been struck with the government last month. Its members voted to reject that. And so now the question is, to what extent will nurses stage bigger walkouts? They will be voting again next month, and that has, raised some questions as to whether or not the members want to be striking all year. But at the moment, it seems like it certainly could be a possibility. And there is speculation, although it's denied in some papers, sort of hinted at in others, that the nurses and the junior doctors may team up, so to speak, in order to put more pressure on the government to give them salary boosts. Of course, there is more public sympathy at the moment for the nurses than the junior doctors. There's a slight majority in most polls for the junior doctors, but the nurses are well ahead. So I think, there are question marks over whether or not that would be an efficient thing for the RCN to do. But we certainly could be looking down the barrel of many more strikes in the coming weeks and months at a time when the waitlist in NHS England is well above 7 million and counting.
Looking at the front of the Times, very similar headline actually for them. NHS nurses threaten to strike until Christmas. Kevin, what do you make, especially at that point that Kate was making there? Pat Cullen, leader of the RCN, saying there are no plans on the nurses' side for coordinated industrial action, but she didn't explicitly rule it out, did she?
No, she's not ruling it out. I mean, Pat Cullen is in a bit of an awkward position herself because she had recommended, the RCN leadership had recommended to their members that they accept this deal and said at the time that it was the best deal that they could get after months of talks with the government. And now she's having to obviously go back in and call on Steve Barclay to come up with more money. Now, thus far, certainly writing in The Sun on Sunday this morning, Steve Barclay gave no indication that more money would be forthcoming. I don't think the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, is in favour of increasing the offer. So it's a bit of a difficult one for both sides. Now, obviously, adding to the confusion, actually, is the fact that Unison members, who are nurses, they voted to accept the deal on Friday. So there's a split in the ranks there. Obviously, other unions are balancing as well. I think the government now wants to wait to see what the result is of those ballots to illustrate whether or not the RCN is an outlier or whether it's representative of the majority of nurses. So, I think a lot hinges on the results of those ballots. And then, of course, then the RCN themselves, once these strikes at the end of the month, the 48-hour strike that they've got planned, once that is out of the way, they are reballoting to see whether they can get a renewed mandate from their members for, as Pat Cullen said, strikes going on all the way up until Christmas. So yeah, as you say, it's not great for Rishi Sunak. I think he had hoped that the public sector strikes were coming to an end. They did manage to reach agreement with a few unions earlier in the year, but we've now got the junior doctors are still at loggerheads with the government, teachers as well, civil servants, and obviously nurses. So yeah, it's not looking great on the public sector strike front.
Yeah, and those splits that you're talking about between the unions, Kate, are on the front of the eye in their headline. Ministers pin hopes of end to nurses' strikes on union splits over pay deal, making the point that ministers believe the RCN could struggle to win that second ballot for strike action when it does consult its members, because the other unions are more happy with it.
Well, this would be the best outcome from the government, and I should point out that's a pretty low bar at this point, given the fact that these strikes have been going on for months and negotiations have been a real struggle. But the best case scenario is that the RCN in the second ballot does not see the majority of its members want to keep striking until Christmas, and the unison decision will certainly weigh on people's minds and weigh on other nurses' minds, the fact that they did accept this pay deal. I think this week is going to produce some quite interesting data. Usually you can't make too much out of monthly data when it comes to anything from the labor market to GDP figures, but we do have new inflation data out this week. And one of the government's strong talking points for everybody, not just for public sector unions, is that the rate of inflation is going to come down quite rapidly this year. That is their prediction. It has been a really tough start to the year. We actually saw the rate of inflation increase slightly in the last update. But if we start to see meaningful movement on that figure, I suspect the government will double down in its position that around a 5% pay raise is what they can realistically offer. When it comes to the rate of inflation, and also just looking at the state of the government finances at the moment and the very precarious position that they're in after COVID. Of course, if the rate of inflation keeps ticking up, it becomes much harder for the government to make that argument. So I'm going to be looking at that data this week. I think that will be interesting. But, the overwhelming question, I think, still remains not so much about pay, but about how this is impacting on patients. There have been real warnings from NHS representatives about the impact that these strikes are having on patients. It is obviously in everybody's interest to bring this to an end. So, that does put significant pressure on government, almost regardless of the data, to continue to try to try to get the unions to the table to have these conversations, and vice versa, because the longer doctors and nurses are out of hospital, the harder it is for the patients who are desperately needing those appointments.
Yeah, it was the boss of the NHS Confederation, wasn't it, on Sky today, Matthew Taylor, I think his name is, saying that this action, Kevin, could endanger patients' safety and dignity.
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, the RCN have said that they will intensify their industrial action in this 48-hour strike that's coming at the end of the month by not having opt-outs for nurses in cancer care wards, accident and emergency, intensive care. In the previous strikes, they have not been on strike because they obviously need to provide care for people in that situation. But they've said, no, that will not take place the next time. So that obviously increases the chances of people not getting the urgent care that they need. And I thought it was interesting as well this morning that Wes Streeting, Labour's shadow health secretary, when he was on the media round this morning, he said that Labour can't support these strikes now either because of the risk to patient safety, which I think is pretty significant coming from a Labour politician.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting as well. OK, well, let's move on. It seems every time that I present the press preview, there's another depressing headline about children's mental health, Kate. And tonight is no exception with their splash on the front of The Guardian.
Yeah, this is research carried out by House Magazine and shared with The Guardian that finds that roughly 250,000 children with mental health problems have been turned away, essentially denied help on the NHS. And this is a result of them having to raise the threshold for what would qualify as getting access to NHS services in 2021, 2022, because the demand for these services has skyrocketed so rapidly. Obviously, the strikes aren't helping, but this isn't really a strike story. The mental health crisis within the NHS has been going on for years and made so much worse by the pandemic and the impact of lockdowns and lost education for these children. And, as you say, Jonathan, it's depressing. I mean, it's really terrifying stuff. The many hundreds of thousands of children that are being denied access to mental health care, for whom, we can assume most of those parents won't really have anywhere else to turn. And denying them access to treatment now can lead to serious complications down the road. It's a reminder how limited resources are in the current structure, and that we are disappointing and letting down arguably the most vulnerable who are in the most need of the care.
Yeah, and so varied the care, isn't it, Kevin, depending on where you live?
Yeah, a real postcode lottery. Some areas spending 4 times as much as others on mental health services for adolescents and children, which is, almost as worrying as the fact that so many are not getting any treatment whatsoever. So a lot obviously depends on where you live, will dictate what kind of treatment or quality of care that you get. So yeah, it's a really important piece of journalism. I think this, hats off to the House magazine for uncovering these figures, and it's incumbent now, I think, on politicians and for the government to respond to this. I'm sure there'll be searching questions being asked in Parliament this week now that MPs are back from their Easter break, because this is something that cuts across all boundaries, class boundaries, racial boundaries, whatever. It can be anyone's children who can be affected by this. And this is something that really needs to be addressed, because it is a problem which is only increasing. And it's another example of the strain and the pressure that the National Health Service is under.
Yeah, I was speaking to a teacher yesterday who was saying that she's never known anything like it in terms of the number of children in her class, and she's a primary school teacher needing help. And I see here a quote from the head of external affairs at the charity Young Minds saying, this research shows a system in total shutdown, Kate, with no clear government plan to solve it.
Yeah, I think that's about right. It sums it up. Of course, the NHS is on track in a few years' time to account for roughly 45% of day-to-day government spending. It isn't that money isn't being put into the NHS, but time and time again, we find that it just isn't funneling to the front lines. It isn't funneling to pay raises for the staff, and it doesn't seem to be funneling to patient care. I think the system has a lot to answer for here, and no doubt this needs to be prioritized, and the government is ultimately responsible because the government runs the NHS. So they need to come up with some kind of solution here. But we are stuck in a really terrible system where the monopoly healthcare provider that people are dependent on just is not providing for them. And in this case, it's children that are struggling with mental health issues because of a really difficult past few years. It is heartbreaking. It's also unjustifiable. As Kevin said, hats off to the House magazine and The Guardian for flagging this, because I suspect this is going to be one of the stories of the decade, the impact of the past few years on children and how they're going to grow up with that legacy.